Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to Filmsplaining. I'm your host, Martyn Strange. This is a podcast where I teach you how to watch movies. If you don't know me, I'm a writer, editor, composer, and a lifelong fan and student of cinema. On the show, I talk about movies that I love, why I love them, and why you should love them too. Happy New Year! It's 2025. Holy shit. Last year, when I started this show, I decided that I wanted the first episode of each year to be a kind of look back at the previous year in movies. I don't often cover new films on the podcast because I like to have plenty of time and distance from them and historical context and other research that I can pull from. But this is always like just a fun exercise to go through what I thought were the best films of the year. For some reason, I've been doing this thing where I do the number of movies that's the same number of the year that I'm looking at. So I did 23 best films of 2023. Now I'm doing 24 best films of 2024. There's really no rhyme or reason to this other than it's kind of amusing to me and is sort of an interesting exercise. I determine the year of a film by when it was released here in the US, either theatrically or on streaming. The theatrical release can be wide release or limited. But if something played a festival for like a few hundred to 1,000 people to see in the year before it was actually released, I don't count that as the previous year's film. I count it when people are able to actually watch it. So a handful of these films may say 2023 when you look them up on IMDb or Letterboxd, but I consider them 2024 releases because they were released theatrically in that year or on streaming. I don't think I have many straight to streaming releases here in this list. This list is also going to be on my Letterboxd. If you want to take a look at that, I will include a link in the description of this episode. I want to start out with some honorable mentions because I think 2024 was a pretty solid B to B plus movie year. There are a handful of A movies and even fewer A plus movies, which we'll get to at the top of my list. But all of these films I watched and enjoyed and found stuff to recommend about them, so I wanted to mention them before we get into the actual 24 movies. The first one is The People's Joker. This movie was actually made in 2022, but was only released in 2024 because of some distribution and legal issues that the director Vera Drew had to go through in order to get it released. This film is directed by and starring Vera Drew. It's a kind of trans allegory madcap dramedy that's told through the lens of these DC comic book characters. Vera Drew's character is kind of an amalgam of the Joker and Harley Quinn, and she's in a toxic relationship with this person who is also a kind of amalgam of those two characters, but leans very closely into Jared Leto's Joker from Suicide Squad. I just thought this was really fun. It has a really inventive visual style, and all of these kind of DIY, very, very low budget effects and stylizations. It's a very punk rock movie. It's very in your face and transgressive about everything that it's saying and everything that it's putting on screen. I'm really thankful to Mubi for finally releasing this movie here in the States. I'm not sure if it's available in the UK or in other countries yet, but if you can, please seek out The People's Joker. I had a great time watching this. The second one is Beetlejuice. Directed by Tim Burton, of course, starring Michael Keaton, Winona Ryder. All of these people coming back from the original film. Jenna Ortega plays the young daughter, who is basically Lydia Dietz Jr. This goes back to Burton's roots a bit with so many practical, fun effects. There's another great stop motion sequence in this movie, just like in the first one. And it's just so great to see Keaton back in this suit again, doing these things, making the jokes that he makes and the references. I just had a blast watching this in the theater. I went to see it with a friend, and we were the only two people in the whole theater. And then I rewatched it again on HBO Max recently. There are entire plot threads and characters in this movie that go absolutely nowhere and really mean nothing other than to have another actor's name on the poster. But it's so entertaining and fun, and I feel like really the only kind of way you could do a sequel to Beetlejuice. So I would definitely recommend it, especially if you're a fan of the original and have not seen this yet. The next one is Kneecap. This is one that was recommended to me online. It's an Irish movie based on this story of a rap group in Ireland. It's very kinetic and very like exciting filmmaking with lots of political commentary about finding and sort of championing your roots. Contains all these original songs by this group, Kneecap, who, the film follows kind of chronicling their rise to fame in Ireland. And it's really fun, exciting, very edgy, and made me want to go to Ireland. And was luckily recognized quite a bit at the BAFTAs this year. So that's very exciting for these young filmmakers who I'm really curious to see what they do next, if they stick with making movies or if they're just going to go back to making music. This movie is on Netflix if you want to watch it right now. Next one is Immaculate, directed by Michael Mohan and starring Sydney Sweeney. One of two nunsploitation horror movies this year. This one has callbacks to stuff like Rosemary's Baby. Sydney Sweeney gives an extraordinary performance here. It's very strong, and she is playing this nun who is kind of being used by this very cultish convent in Italy to birth a new messiah. And it gets really nasty and really kind of over the top. A lot of fun. There's another nun movie that I'll talk about later that I liked much better, but I would definitely recommend this to any horror fan, especially if you're really into religious horror. I think it's pretty seismic as far as that subgenre goes. This, I think I watched on Hulu and should still be available there to watch. Then we have Baby Girl, which was released here in the US on Christmas Day, along with Nosferatu and A Complete Unknown. Crazy weekend that was. This movie is directed by Helena Rain, whose previous film, Bodies, 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 I really enjoyed. It stars Nicole Kidman and Harris Dickinson. This movie kind of sold something in the trailers that wasn't quite what we got with the complete package. I think this is happening more and more lately, where trailers are kind of selling us something that's not exactly the movie that they're going to show us. And it makes sense, but it's also kind of aggravating from an audience perspective. It's an erotic thriller that just isn't very erotic, but has some really interesting commentary on like age gap romances, especially in the workplace, and powerful women doing what they have to do in order to stay in power. I just wish that it had gone further. But the chemistry between Kidman and Dickinson is electric, and there's all of this interesting like commentary on Nicole Kidman as a celebrity and how she's aged and how she has like really just sort of transformed the last half of her career doing only projects that she really wants to do from filmmakers she really wants to champion. I saw this in theaters and it was a fun time, but again, I was expecting more. I was expecting something a little more extreme, and it feels kind of tame by comparison to the sort of 80s erotic thrillers that it's trying to emulate. Next is Maxine, the third and final film in Ty West's X trilogy, starring, of course, Mia Goth. It's the conclusion here. In my opinion, the least exciting of the bunch. It echoes plenty of other kind of better LA underworld movies from the 80s that I would also recommend, but it's so well made, and Ty West is a great craftsman, and there's some really fun sequences, some really fun kills, and exciting stuff that I think is going to draw in a lot of younger audiences to start watching things from the past that this movie is very clearly riffing on, stuff like Hardcore and Eyes of Laura Mars, other kind of LA noir-y type thrillers from that era. I was, again, just hoping for something more from this movie, something a little more extreme, something that reaches the heights of both X and Pearl, which I think are much better films. But it's a fitting conclusion, I think, and there are some great things. It's great to see Mia Goth perform as this character one last time and see what she gets to do. But I think I could have done with a bit more exploration of the whole world that she's involved in, especially before she kind of gets her big break, so to speak. Saw this movie in theaters. I'm not sure where it's streaming now. I believe HBO Max, if you want to watch it. Next is Will and Harper, a documentary from Netflix about best friends Will Ferrell and Harper Steele, who drive across country together to find new experiences and to try and better understand each other. It deals with Harper Steele's coming out as a trans woman and how she relates to the rest of the world now, and especially relates to the rest of her country, because she's very into going on these road trips and discovering new towns and new places and little things along the way. These things were very important to her, and this movie is about her trying to reckon with being able to do that now. And also with her friend Will Ferrell, they were writing partners at SNL, understanding who she is now and how their friendship has changed or how it hasn't changed, and how they can move forward. I think it's a very, very poignant movie and very moving. It's especially important to the time period we're in now. And it's also very funny. You just get to watch these two hilarious people crack jokes at each other while on this road trip. I definitely recommend this movie. I'm surprised it didn't get a nomination, but all of the other docs nominated here are very lauded. Cuckoo, a horror film released last summer, directed by Tillman Singer, stars Hunter Schafer and Dan Stevens. I talked about this movie a little bit in my Summer of Horror episode, which you can go back and listen to if you've not heard that yet. I saw this in theaters. I liked it. Again, these are this B to B plus movie year. These are all just kind of really sturdily made films that I felt could have been elevated a little bit. But it's this kind of giallo tinged psychological horror creature feature. Hunter Schafer is incredible in this movie. It's nice to see her get a really strong lead performance. And I'm very excited to see where her career goes from here. And Dan Stevens is just chewing the scenery as this kind of mad German scientist. He's doing really good stuff. The creature design is interesting here. Something else that I felt like could have been expanded on a little bit, but this is a fun one and it's definitely worth a watch. Next is Lisa Frankenstein, filmed by Zelda Williams, written by Diablo Cody, and it stars Catherine Newton. This is just a fun kind of coming-of-age horror comedy. Very, very much emulates John Hughes movies from the 80s, Breakfast Club, Pretty in Pink, all that stuff is here, but it's also got this addition of a kind of zombified Frankenstein story. This is the most Diablo Cody script I think that Diablo Cody has ever written, if you know what I mean, if you know her writing from Jennifer's Body or Juno. It's very tongue-in-cheek, very cute, and very self-aware writing, and that comes through in the film too. Usually I'm not really into so much cutesy stuff, but this really kind of hit at the right time, I guess, for me. I watched this on Hulu, and I believe it's still there if you want to check it out. The last honorable mention is Humanist Vampire Seeking Consenting Suicidal Person, which wins the 2024 award for longest and most mouthful of a title. It's a Canadian film about this young vampire who has to learn to make her first kill on her own. Up until this point, her family has been making the kills and providing blood for her, but it's this kind of puberty adolescence metaphor. She befriends this suicidal guy who can't quite get there. He doesn't quite have the courage to do it on his own. This movie is in the same vein as stuff like Let the Right One In and Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, if you're into those kind of movies. Very similar kind of framework of a story, and also very similar in tone, except it's not quite as violent, say, as Let Me In or Let the Right One In. A really sweet, fun hang for this movie. It's available on Mubi now. Okay, let's get into the list. The order here shifted around a lot for me, especially as I watched a few of the later films that I was really trying to catch up with in the month of January. And the last one just kind of popped on to this last spot right after I watched it about a week ago. It's called The Girl with the Needle. This is a film from Denmark, directed by Magnus von Horn. It stars Vic Carmen Son. And, oh boy, this is a tough hang. This was a tough watch. This is a very bleak and harrowing tale about a young woman who's struggling to make ends meet, who becomes pregnant with her boss's child, and she is forced to put the baby up for adoption when the boss leaves because his mother, who's this very well-to-do kind of rich socialite, forbids their marriage and him having this child with her. The woman is basically kind of thrown into a very uneasy, chaotic situation here. She has to give the baby up, and also her husband, who she believed to be dead up until this point, she's been writing him letters and he's not been responding. He was in the war. He shows up and he's horribly disfigured from injuries sustained in combat. And he's wearing this sort of half-face plastic mask that's sort of made to look like a human face. It's very eerie and uncanny. And she meets a woman, forms this connection with her, and they start finding homes for these unwanted babies. But something is amiss here. There's a terrifying discovery that she makes about 2/3 of the way into the film. I don't want to spoil it because it's not only is it a hard film to watch, but if you know what happens going in, it kind of makes it even harder. There's some really strong performances here, the lead performance especially. The cinematography is absolutely gorgeous. This film's in black and white, and there's just a sense of dread and utter desolation in post-war Denmark that they do here after World War I. Immaculate production design. I was really, really stunned by this movie. It's not anything that I maybe ever want to revisit if I do revisit it, but once again, it's available on Mubi. Mubi really stepping it up with the acquisitions this year. They've just done such a good job with their slate. Number 23 is A Real Pain, written and directed by Jesse Eisenberg. It stars Jesse Eisenberg and Kieran Culkin as these two cousins who reconnect after the passing of their grandmother. They take this trip to Poland to see her childhood home, which is along this Holocaust tour where they're stopping at various locations in Poland. They have this tour guide who's teaching them about the historical significance of these places, and it becomes a kind of buddy road trip comedy, but also these guys who couldn't be more different are trying to kind of reconnect with each other and find some common ground. Kieran Culkin has locked down this Oscar nomination and win from the get-go since this film premiered at Sundance, I think, early last year. But I think we're also not talking about how good Jesse Eisenberg is in this movie, especially at the dinner scene. He delivers this scorching monologue that's really remarkable. This was a lot of fun to watch. I was hoping it maybe got a little deeper than it did, but the writing is really good here. I would not be surprised if Jesse Eisenberg wins Best Screenplay at the Oscars. I highly recommend watching A Real Pain if any of these things appeal to you. It's available on Hulu now. Number 22 is The Piano Lesson, directed by Malcolm Washington. It stars John David Washington, Danielle Deadwyler, and Sam Jackson. This is based on an August Wilson play about the history and legacy of a piano in this family lineage in the Deep South. I think this probably does work better as a play, ultimately, after watching it. It's very dialogue heavy and it's staged very much like a play. I would like to see this staged at some point. But I think this is a really strong debut from Malcolm Washington as a filmmaker. Some of the things he's doing are a little bit rote and by the book and kind of predictable, but he's also kind of just already proving himself very capable at staging dialogue and blocking scenes in an interesting way. The stunning performance from Danielle Deadwyler. She delivers just so much heart and just raw, open emotion here in this movie. Shocked that she wasn't nominated. Seems like the second year in a row that she was snubbed. But this movie is available on Netflix. I think if it was released in theaters, it would have gotten a wider audience and maybe some more acclaim. But that's where we are at this day and age. 21 is Nosferatu. This is directed by Robert Eggers. Stars Lily Rose Depp, Nicholas Hoult, Bill Skarsgård, Willem Dafoe, and many more great actors. It's a remake of the classic 1922 silent film based on the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. I went fully in depth on this movie with my buddy Alex Walsh in a bonus episode on Nosferatu. We compared it to the original. We talked about everything that we loved about it, everything that didn't work about it, and where it kind of fits in Robert Eggers' canon. So I won't go too in depth on it here. I watched it in theaters. I really wanted to try and catch it when it was still in theaters again, but sadly I was unable to. There's lots to recommend about this movie. It just didn't totally work as a whole to me, but I would still recommend watching it, especially if you're a fan of Robert Eggers. If you haven't seen it yet, that would be kind of shocking. Number 20 is Kinds of Kindness, directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. Stars Emma Stone, Jesse Plemons, and Margaret Qualley, with a cameo from Hunter Schafer. This is a really weird, bizarre anthology story featuring 3 separate tales about characters who have to perform different kindnesses out of a sense of loyalty or devotion or subservience. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's ambition. They're very loosely linked by this one character who's referred to by his initials, who plays a very minor role in each of the stories, but is kind of the through line. All of the actors play different characters in each story, so it's kind of cool to see them turning different gears depending on which story they're in. And it's really kind of a return to Lanthimos' early work as far as like the very dry, very deadpan humor, very caustic language, and just general awkwardness among the characters and in their performances. It's not among his best movies and far from my favorite, but it was still incredibly entertaining. I saw it in theaters. I really need to watch it again soon. I believe it's available now on either Hulu or Max. 19 is a film called La Chimera. This was directed by Eliche Rohrwacher. I hope I'm saying that right. It stars Josh O'Connor and Isabella Rossellini. This one really caught me by surprise. I was kind of stunned by how much I enjoyed this film. It's a dreamy, kind of effervescent drama about this young man who's in Italy. He robs graves and tombs with this sort of ragtag group of people that he's cultivated, and they sell these antiques and heirlooms in order to pay for their lifestyle. He's kind of also searching for meaning, I think. It's very funny and mysterious and gorgeous to look at, like just drop dead beautiful cinematography. And I think what really struck me so much about this film is that it's a better Isabella Rossellini performance here than the one that she's currently nominated for in Conclave, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But she has so much more to do in this film and is so much more of a central part of the narrative in this film that it's just stunning to me that they're running her a campaign for Conclave and not this movie. I guess technically this was a 2023 release, so it was probably not eligible for the 2024 Oscars, but like once again, this film was not released in the US until 2024, which is why it's on this list. I highly recommend you watch this. It's available to watch on Hulu. At 17, of course, is Conclave. Directed by Edward Berger, it's his follow-up to All Quiet on the Western Front. This stars Ralph Fiennes, John Lithgow, Stanley Tucci, and Isabella Rossellini. It's a story about the cardinals of the Catholic Church, and they're gathering to pick a new pope because the pope, the previous one, dies at the beginning of this film. And as they are gathering here, the story kind of unravels, revealing plots against each other, members of the cardinals basically intentionally seeding stories against each other in order to hopefully win the nomination for Pope. It's all about betrayal and intrigue and scandals and these wildly inappropriate and hilarious interactions with each other. Ralph Fiennes is just phenomenal, as he always is. It's a trashy airport novel meets high art through the stunning craft of it. Another film has brilliant cinematography this year. I really liked this one, and it's one of those great guys talking in rooms movies that you can go back to again and again and just dig through all of the layers, all of the subtext in what they're saying to each other. This movie is available to watch on Peacock right now, which is where I watched it. Next is Dee Dee, another film available to watch on Peacock right now. This was directed by Sean Wong, stars Isaac Wong and Joan Chen, she of Twin Peaks fame. It's a coming-of-age story about this Taiwanese-American teenager who is really struggling to fit in and make friends at school. And it's set in 2008 amidst MySpace and Transworld Skateboarding Magazine. And this just feels ripped straight from my adolescence. I was 16 or 17 in 2008, virtually living the same exact kind of life that this character is living. I was trying to skateboard and trying to be cool and make friends, and I was listening to metal music. And there's just so much about how Sean Wong made this world like so pitch perfect accurate. And it's also a really moving and touching story about a mother and son who are trying to understand each other at completely different stages in their lives. And it just really hit me at home. It really hit me in the heart. Another big surprise recommended to me by my buddy Matt on Threads. Please watch DD if you've not seen it yet. Number 16 is The Bike Riders, directed by Jeff Nichols. It stars Austin Butler, Tom Hardy, Jodie Comer, and Michael Shannon. This is a Scorsese imitation that does for bikers what Goodfellas did for gangsters. It's reminiscent of The Wild One and Easy Rider, and these films are even like part of the text in the film. This movie is very picaresque. It's based on a photojournalism book, which I think is the first time like a photo book has been the kind of direct source of adaptation for a film. I don't know, but it seems like the first time that that's ever happened. And you're just hanging out with this kind of bunch of guys who really want to be outlaws, but they actually, most of them have sort of nice jobs and families at home, and they start this biking club. And, you know, Austin Butler's doing his best James Dean here. He looks incredible. There's a sequence where he sits on his bike outside of Jodie Comer's apartment all night long, just smoking cigarettes, just sitting there waiting for her to come out. I think this is Tom Hardy's best work in years. He's just doing really great stuff. And seeing him do this kind of thing after he's been toiling away at fucking Venom movies for the last 10 years was just really refreshing. This is the kind of film that I just want to live in. And it's one of those things that when I saw it in theaters, it made me want to go out and buy a motorcycle and a leather jacket. Highly recommend The Bike Riders. 15 is The First Omen, directed by Arkasha Stevenson, starring Nell Tiger Free. This is the other nun movie from this year. This one is very haunting, and it's a prequel to the classic Omen from 1975. A very, very scary movie. Seeing this in theaters was a great experience. It just gruesome imagery, a great central performance from Nell Tiger Free, who's very much channeling Isabelle Adjani in Possession. Stylistically, it's reminiscent of that movie and other 70s horrors. This was, I think, the first movie that I rewatched from this year as soon as it came up on Hulu, and it's just as effective. I cannot wait to see where Arkasha Stevenson goes in her career, because I think it's a really, really strong debut from her. This movie is available to watch on Hulu right now. 14 is Civil War, a film directed by Alex Garland, starring Kirsten Dunst, Wagner Moura, and Kaylee Spaney, who had an incredible year. This follows a group of photojournalists after the outbreak of a U.S. Civil War, which rages all the way to the White House. The audience POV in this movie is the POV of the journalists at all times. We never leave their side. We are following on the ground through their perspective what's happening kind of in real time. There's no political stance taken in this film or an explanation of how the war started. It got a lot of pushback for that. This is a very polarizing movie. A lot of people felt it cowardly to not take a certain side. I discussed my personal thoughts on the movie and why I feel like this was the right decision with Left of the Projector. If you want to check out that episode on Civil War, I'll link it in the description. But seeing this in theaters was a truly stunning experience. The sound, when you hear the gunshots in this movie, it makes you think of like the gunshots in Heat. They're so loud and propulsive and hit you right in the chest. Very masterful filmmaking. Whether or not you think it's narratively cohesive, it's still just like an amazing experience to undergo. And I would highly recommend it if you haven't watched it yet. This film just popped up on Max recently, Civil War. 13, I Saw the TV Glow, directed by Jane Schoenbrunn, stars Justice Smith and Jack Haven. This is another coming-of-age story and another trans allegory, but it mixes genres and styles to form this kind of nebulous, very eerie and scary, intoxicating world. It's about self-love and self-identity and discovering who you are. This is kind of the most reminiscent of David Lynch, I would say, recent movie put out in the last few years. And it seems to really even cite Twin Peaks as a main part of the central narrative. The TV show that the characters are watching in the film, The Pink Opaque, bears all these similarities to Twin Peaks. And you can also just feel kind of the influence of Lynch all over this movie. The musical performances that kind of happen in the middle of things, and the transitions and dissolves and certain scenes bleeding into each other. I was really shocked by this movie, and it stuck with me for a long time. Very hard to watch some sequences here in this, but I would still recommend it just because the filmmaking is really strong. There's lots of inventive camera work. There's a scene where two characters are talking from completely different places, and by the end of the scene, they have ended up in the same place. That I thought was very effective. I'm really looking forward to seeing the next film from Jane Schoenbrunn. This is available to watch on Max right now. Check it out. Number 12 is Love Lies Bleeding, directed by Rose Glass, stars Kristen Stewart and Katie O'Brien and Ed Harris. This is a lesbian noir thriller about a bodybuilder who gets involved with this woman whose father is a gangster, and she kind of gets in too deep with that character. It really echoes things like Bound and Thelma and Louise and even True Romance. This is part of the kind of Lovers on the Run canon that I made up with my friend Marta on a podcast from last year. If you want to check that out, we talked a little bit about this movie. But there are lots of interesting visual choices here. Rose Glass is taking some big swings, especially in the third act. And there's a stunning performance from Katie O'Brien. When this movie came out, I actually kind of pegged her to be a sort of possible awards frontrunner, and she was just completely ignored by every possible voting body. But I think it's a really great performance. There's also a great soundtrack in this movie, and the soundtrack and the score really add to the dark, moody, sensual overall tone of the piece. This is another one that I rewatched pretty soon after I'd seen it in theaters. It's on Max now, if you want to check out Love Lies Bleeding. 11 is Alien Romulus, directed by Fede Alvarez, starring Kaylee Spaney, David Johnson, and Archie Renault. I talked at length about this movie in my Alien Anthology episode, which kicked off season 2. So if you want to know all my thoughts on it, go there, because I really dive deep into it. But I have my popcorn bucket back here to show that I saw it in theaters. I really liked this movie. I think it's a ton of fun and also really silly and over bloated and just kind of loses the plot in the third act of the movie. But there's so much great tension building. Feels very much like a horror video game. It almost gets there to like the echelon of the first two films, but it doesn't quite, because there are so many things holding it back. It's not as effective at home as it was in theaters either, but there's still a lot of fun to be had, and some of the sequences are just great tension building, classic sci-fi horror stuff. I watched this again on Hulu, where it's available to see now. Check out Alien Romulus. Number 10 is A Different Man, directed by Aaron Schimberg. This stars Sebastian Stan, Renata Reinsve, and Adam Pearson. This one I was really looking forward to, and I ended up renting it through Apple as soon as it became available to rent at home, because I had just heard so much exciting stuff about Sebastian Stan's performance and about the makeup effects in this film. It's about this disfigured actor. He's doing these kind of corporate sort of HR style commercials and short videos. That's how he makes his living. But he meets this woman who moves in across from him in his apartment complex. She's a playwright, and they get to know each other, and she offers him this role in her play. It's kind of the dream role for him, because he gets to fully embody himself and who he is. But he is torn and takes this experimental drug to alter his face permanently. The tumors on his face are removed, and suddenly he looks like Sebastian Stan, one of the most gorgeous looking men on the planet. And now he is finding that he no longer has what it takes to inhabit this character, because he can't really fully live the life that he needs to live in order to get there physically. He then meets a man who looks exactly like he used to look, played by Adam Pearson, who is disfigured in real life. And this guy basically is the much more charming, suave, successful, friendly, outgoing version of who Sebastian Stan's character wants to be. He becomes very successful, and he starts taking Stan's character's life kind of piece by piece. He takes the role in the play, and then he takes the playwright who was his girlfriend, and it's this really interesting kind of mad spiraling out of control, very reminiscent of the movie Seconds by John Frankenheimer. If you've never seen that movie, there's some really interesting parallels here with that film. Great makeup effects. It's a perfectly paced, really tight thriller. I was kind of blown away by how much I enjoyed this, actually. I believe this film is available to watch now on Max, if you want to check it out. Number 9 is Queer, directed by Luca Guadagnino. It stars Daniel Craig and Drew Starkey. This is an adaptation of a very seminal William S. Burroughs novel that is semi-autobiographical. Burroughs' work is very hard to adapt to screen because it's so much involved with the language and with his particular voice and tone. And some of the things he's describing and inventing on the page are very hard to replicate on screen. You just can't really exactly get the same thing across. David Cronenberg tried this with Naked Lunch, which is Burroughs' most well-known novel. I think some things about that movie work, but ultimately it just doesn't really feel like a faithful adaptation. I think this is as close as we can possibly get here. Luca Guadagnino has talked at length about how important this book was to him when he was a young man, and he's been wanting to adapt it for a long time. They took a lot of liberties here with the script and with adding lots of stuff because the novel is actually very short. I read it last year and there's not much there. So obviously things were kind of expanded on and expounded on. But it's about this man who is yearning and looking for love in Mexico City, and he's strung out on drugs. This is an amazing performance from Daniel Craig. Seeing this in theaters, he really stunned me. The scene where he shoots up is just utterly haunting. And there's this unbroken still shot on him preparing all of the gear that feels like it goes on for like 10 minutes. It's not that long, but it really, really hits you. The costume design, the production design, I mean, Lucasfilms are always filled with just stunning craft. I'm going to talk about another one here soon. There are miniatures, and the way they're shot are just really loving and effective. This kind of splits the difference, I think, between his more weird personal work and the more kind of commercial things that he's better known for. No nominations for this movie whatsoever. I think Daniel Craig was being talked about for a while, but that campaign just totally fell apart. I saw this movie in theaters. It's going to be streaming on Mubi, once again, very soon. So please check out Queer. Really liked it. It's very divisive, and it's not going to be to everyone's taste, but especially if you're a Luca Guadagnino completist, you have to watch this movie. Number 8 is Furiosa. This is directed by George Miller, the great mad scientist of Australia. It stars Anya Taylor-Joy and Chris Hemsworth. I talked about this movie in depth on a previous episode, the Mad Max and the Death of Moviegoing episode of my podcast, which actually turned out to be one of the more popular things I've ever done. A lot of people told me personally that it was their favorite episode because I talked at length about how we had kind of failed this movie with it bombing at the box office and the fact that no one wants to go see this incredible, massive sci-fi epic, and how surprising and shocking that was to me. It's a prequel to Fury Road, and it's focusing on the character of Furiosa and what she went through in her childhood and adolescence to become one of the greatest and most feared warriors of the wasteland. It's epic and electric and incredibly funny. Cannot miss performance from Chris Hemsworth. A huge achievement in cinema, I think. And it's really upsetting to me that this might be the last thing that George Miller ever gets to do in the Mad Max world because it was so financially unviable. But I rewatched it at home, just as good the second time. There are some things that are not as effective, obviously not having that sound and that very propulsive imagery being thrown at you so quickly, like George Miller is so good at doing. But this film's available to watch on Max, and anyone who loves the Mad Max series or George Miller films has to watch it. If you've not watched it yet, that would be kind of surprising. Number 7 is a movie that I was really surprised by how good it was, how much it moved me personally. It's called Red Rooms. This is a French-Canadian movie directed by Pascal Plante, starring Juliette Gariepi. It's about a woman she's a model and also plays online poker, high-stakes online poker, and she's closely following the trial of a serial murderer who is accused of killing several young girls and filming it for distribution on the dark web. Obviously dealing with lots of really dark, gruesome content here. And it plays with this idea of toxic fandoms and of obsessive true crime culture and our obsession with media and with putting these people on display in order to kind of gawk at and analyze them. And the performance here is so interesting because it's entirely internal and very subdued, and you're really not sure about who this character is or what part she plays in this story. I just thought that the filmmaking, narratively and aesthetically here, was so strong. There's an 11-minute, just stunning tracking shot that's just a camera moving around a tiny little courtroom in the opening sequence of this movie without even music to aid it, but it's a masterclass in building tension. Stylistically, I think you can feel a lot of David Fincher influence in this movie. So if you like thrillers like Zodiac and Seven and things that are playing with your expectations of who these characters are, I highly, highly encourage you to watch Red Rooms. I rented this on Apple. It's available to watch there. Hopefully it will be streaming soon so that more people can see it, because I haven't talked to that many people who have been able to check it out yet, but I highly recommend it. Number 6 is The Substance. This is directed by Coralie Farge, a French director. It stars Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley. This is a body horror feminist masterclass in building tension, speaking of building tension, and it's about female aging and agency, and it plays with ideas of celebrity. There's just stunning sound design and visual craft here, from the makeup effects to the very super extreme close-up shots of really gross but beautiful things to look at. There's been all this stuff online of people lining up shots with this movie, of shots in The Shining, very much like just trying to draw the parallels here. Yes, there are a lot of shots in this movie that look like The Shining, but there's also just so much new, inventive, and bold stuff here. There's a really transgressive message to this movie, but also in its visual style. And I can't believe it's kind of broken through in the mainstream like it has. It's become this very pop thing that tons of people have seen and have gone back to rewatch. I saw it in the theaters, and by the end of the kind of blood spraying finale, there were people in the audience groaning, wishing, hoping for it to be over. But I was thrilled by this movie. I watched it again on the streaming service that I think wins this year for sure, which is Mubi, and you can watch it there now. Highly recommend The Substance if you've not checked it out yet. Demi Moore is most likely going to win an Oscar for her performance here. Number 5 is Longlegs. I got my long legs on today. That's not really what he sounds like. I don't know why I did that voice. Seems I wore my long legs today. Is that closer? I don't know. This is directed by Osgood Perkins. Stars Nicolas Cage as the serial killer Longlegs and Micah Monroe. Micah Monroe doing an amazing performance. Another one that I just can't believe was not recognized at all. But this is a horror movie, so it's extremely rare that anyone in a horror movie is going to be recognized for their performance. It's a serial killer thriller with a kind of paranormal twist, reminiscent obviously of Silence of the Lambs, things like Manhunter, even Oz Perkins' previous movie, The Blackcoat's Daughter, as far as the tone and the just creeping, uneasy dread that is present in every single frame of the film. There was a brilliant marketing campaign by Neon for this movie, and say what you will about it, a lot of people have complained that this movie didn't live up to the hype, but that marketing campaign absolutely did its job, and it did it perfectly. It got people to go see this movie. This movie made almost $100 million, I think, which is huge for a horror film, especially something of this size and kind of contained story. And the movie's just stunning in its use of space, of silence, and this sickly imagery that feels very familiar to you if you like things like this with, that are similar to Seven or Silence of the Lambs yet again. But it's also very having fun with itself. I saw this movie in theaters twice. The second time, a friend of mine wanted to go see it, and I had already seen it, but I went with them anyway because it's just like a fun ride, and there's so much here personally that I feel like clicked with me, as far as especially the T-Rex soundtrack and the influence there of glam rock on the killer. I've never really seen that done before, and that stuff is just like right up my alley. Highly recommend Long Legs if you've not seen it yet. One of the most talked about movies of last year, easily. Number 4 is The Brutalist. Got that poster right back there. This is directed by Brady Corbet, and it stars Adrian Brody, Guy Pearce, and Felicity Jones. It's an immigration story about this brilliant architect who becomes the pawn of a rich megalomaniac. And it's also about the struggle of genius and the struggle of artistic integrity. It's about art versus commerce, generational trauma. This is a massive, massive film that is also actually very focused and very small in its scope of the story it's actually following, which is just really a handful of characters and the things that occur in their lives over this 13, possibly 15-year period. But it's dealing with really huge, enormous ideas. And does it really land on all of those ideas? No, but it's forcing you to think about a lot of things. And these are the kinds of movies that people like me want more and more of these days. It's really forcing you to look certain things in the face about how we treat the arts and how art has become commodified and really extrapolated into these very easily digestible products to be sold. This movie is 3.5 hours long. It is epic in its length and size, if not in its actual narrative. And there's an intermission. I saw this movie in IMAX. I've talked about this movie a bit in my previous Oscars predictions video. So if you want to hear more of my thoughts on it, check that out. The AI controversy, I think I do have to address. Look, anyone who knows me knows that I'm firmly against the use of AI, especially in filmmaking. And I think, after reading the stories, my opinion of it is just that it was completely unnecessary to do the things that they chose to do with this technology. Correcting the pronunciations of Adrian Brody and Felicity Jones's performance in Hungarian just seems like a completely unnecessary thing for me to do. Like, just let their performances live as what they are. It doesn't have to be perfect. Nothing has to be perfect. This movie is about the struggle of making art and the persistence of the human spirit, and using AI technology to perfect certain imperfections is kind of like flying in the face of the message of the movie to me, especially the use of the generative AI, which was used to create certain architectural sketches in the epilogue of the movie. That's just, if you can't afford to get somebody to draw those sketches, just don't have the scene in the movie. It's just completely superfluous to what you're already doing. My perception on the film is a little bit colored by this. I don't think it was the right move. I think their justifications for doing so are pretty weak, but all that to say, this is still a magnificent movie that just completely floored me and was one of the best viewing experiences in a theater I've had in a very long time. I can't wait to watch it again. And I think it has good to possibly zero chance of awards consideration this year. But in any other year, this movie would be like the only movie that people were talking about. And in some ways it has been, but I'm concerned that not enough people have seen it. Please see The Brutalist if it's available to watch in your area. They're doing very limited releases on IMAX screens, so check it out if you can. One of the best of the year, hands down. My number 3 is Challengers, another Luca Guadagnino movie from 2024. It stars Zendaya, Mike Feist, and Josh O'Connor. And it's this love triangle between this former tennis champ and two potential future champs who she kind of takes under her wings. She gets involved with both of them at various stages in their lives, and it explores this dynamic of sexuality and power and sport as the art of seduction and the art of seduction as sport. And it's just such a propulsive, entertaining film to watch because of the way that Luca is using this device of tennis to show us things on screen that are typically described in completely different ways in other movies. The thrilling score from Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. Massive snub at the Oscars there. I talked about that as well in my Oscars video. Just no nominations across the board for anything here, which is shocking because it's just such a great movie. It's very chic. It's very hip and new and modern and just a fun theatrical experience and really a very good showcase for this new kind of generation of movie stars. All three performers here in the leads were fantastic. I loved everything about what each of them were doing in their respective characters. I'm going to watch this one again as soon as possible. Number 2 is Dune Part 2. This is directed by Denis Villeneuve. Stars Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Austin Butler, Javier Bardem, Rebecca Ferguson, Florence Pugh, Josh Brolin. The list goes on and on. This is a massive cast. Most of who you saw in the first part, except for the characters who died, are here again. And there's this whole new crop of people too. It's the second part of Villeneuve's massive adaptation of the classic sci-fi novel from Frank Herbert that inspired Star Wars. It inspired many other Dune adaptations, David Lynch's Dune, Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune. There was a miniseries on Sci-Fi Network, I believe. It's sci-fi filmmaking at its highest achievable level. Just everything that Denis Villeneuve and his team, Greg Fraser and Joe Walker and Hans Zimmer, everything that they achieved here is just simply remarkable. Exquisite craft all around. From top to bottom, a generally kind of transcendent movie experience when I saw this in theaters. I believe I saw it twice, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember for sure, but I did rewatch it on Max recently. And man, this is just a movie that I think will go down in history as one of the most overlooked as far as the Oscars goes, and everyone will be scratching their heads wondering why it didn't get its flowers. I just think it's one of those rare feats where the second part of a proposed trilogy outdoes the first movie, just in like every way. The performances here, phenomenal. I mean, Timothée Chalamet is doing stuff that I had never seen him do up until this point. Austin Butler is doing some crazy shit. Zendaya is so good in this movie. She's just embodying this character so fully and making us really, really feel for her, especially by the end of it. And it's a fall from grace story. It's a rise and fall from grace story, all wrapped up kind of very neatly in one film. There are some pacing things here and there, sometimes it is sort of seems like it's going to collapse under its own weight, but just every sequence is more impressive than the last. So many set pieces, the sandworm riding sequence, and obviously the final siege and final showdown between Feyd-Rautha and Paul. I just love this movie, and I cannot wait for Dune Messiah, although it's going to be probably several years that we'll all have to wait. Please watch Dune Part 2 if you've not seen it. If you've not seen Dune Part 1, watch them both. What a thrilling experience to have both of these films complete a whole sci-fi epic. And that brings me to my number 1 movie of 2024, which of course is Anora, directed by Sean Baker, starring Mikey Madison. This movie follows a sex worker who gets involved with this wild, irresponsible young son of a wealthy Russian oligarch. They get married very quickly and then are very quickly forced to annul their marriage. The handlers of this kid find out about the marriage and they descend upon their house, and then the kid runs away and goes missing, and we spend much of the rest of the time following Annie, Anora, the sex worker, with these Armenian guys who are very funny. It's like a Three Stooges scenario with her, and there's so much I can say about this movie. I went pretty in depth on this movie on a review with my buddies Dan and Jared on Concessions. I will link that in the description if you want to check that full review out. I also mentioned this movie as one of my best of the decade so far on ContraZoom's podcast about the best movies of the decade so far. We're following Annie as she thinks, this is going to be her ticket to a better life. It's just so funny and so charming and sad and heartfelt and intense. It really never lets off the gas until certain moments, especially towards the end, where things really quieten down. I talked about this particular moment on the Concessions podcast when we reviewed Anora. but she's standing in front of the window and it's snowing and everything is quiet. And it's like really the first full release you get from the movie. And it's also her first kind of realization of things have not worked out the way that she wanted them to or the way that she thought they were going to. I think this is Sean Baker's culmination of everything that he is good at in filmmaking and the stories he likes to tell. It's already been picked up by the Criterion Collection. I cannot wait to get my hands on that disc and dive into all the special features. Again, I will include the many things I've said about Anora here in the description, but just a flooring, very emotional cinematic experience that I haven't really had with many other movies, especially from this year. So that's why it's my number one. Okay, so that's it. That's the list. I'll have the Letterboxd list down here for you to check out if you want to check out what these movies look like all kind of right next to each other, especially with the cool custom posters that I have on Letterboxd. I just really like doing this kind of exercise every year. It's a neat way to look back at a year in movie watching, and also how things are changing and how the different kinds of stories that we want to see are coming to screen. What are the box office successes? What are the box office failures? What are the critical and audience successes and failures? And how are they changing over time? I really like looking at this stuff, and it's a good excuse to talk about newer films, which I don't do on my show that often. And we'll be back soon with our regular season. We're coming back in March. I'll have another special little video coming up very soon that I'll tell you more about later. But yeah, that's it for now. Until next time, happy viewing.